So let's now turn our attention to theories as a stance. We talked about hypothesis, lens, and now we're on to part 3. This video deals mostly with theories as a stance. And again, that is a view. It's not a bucket that you sort different theories into. Even if some of the examples I share sound like I'm giving you buckets or the types of theories that fit in there, that's not the case. Any researcher can have a view of theory that lines up with this stance view. So here we go. Theories as a stance. Theories from this perspective and research explicitly argue for how the world should be. In other words, they are taking a stance. They are adopting a position. They're making an argument about what the problems are and the way they want the world to be instead. And so this research coming from this area and researchers in this area usually see the world as a series of societal issues that they want to tackle, and they want to do that through research. So in other words, you might have a police officer who wants to do it through rounding up bad guys and putting them in jail. You might have a physician who wants to do it through better medicine, and someone in academia who wants to do it through research. So they write about it, they collect data, they publish about particular issues. So in this area of stance, theories are really hard to tell apart from an individual's personal advocacy or personal politics. In other words, oftentimes people come into their area of research because they care about something before they ever really started researching to begin with. In other words, they had a certain passion that made them go toward a certain major in school. Maybe they went to graduate school because they had that personal passion, or they had this background. Might have been hard experiences, for example. And then they start researching in that area, and they start making an argument about how the world is and how they want it to be, or how it should be. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this. It's just that sometimes you have probably noticed in the most clear instances of this stance perspective that some of the teachers you had, for example, might have a issue that they always manage to bring into the class discussion, even if you don't see how it really relates, but they make it fit somehow. And I'll just exaggerate to make the point. Maybe you're taking a math class, for example, and it's math, right? And you think, oh, this should be about numbers. But then all of a sudden they start bringing out things about gender, or they start bringing out issues of race, or they start bringing out issues of economic inequalities. And by the way, these are all very important issues, and I would guess that most people would care at some level about those issues. However, you'll notice that the people that are adopting a stance point of view toward their research are really bringing it in, even though the connections are not really obvious. They force it in. So I've had several students over the years say, "Oh yeah, I have this one professor that seems to just bash religion any chance he or she gets, and maybe it's maybe there's no exactly great reason to do that, but lines up with their personal view, and so they bring it into that class, even if it doesn't necessarily fit." So this approach assumes that certain problems may be hard to see, and they exist even if they are hard to see. And so researchers in this area see it as their job to make sure that they remind us of these issues over and over again. I can remember this is when I was living in a different state. There was this fella, and anytime you ran into this guy, he wasn't a researcher or professor, he just worked at this place. Anytime you ran into him, and he would talk about a living wage. Oh, we need to get a living wage. And it's similar to the idea of raising the minimum wage. And okay, this is great, interesting idea, I get it, but it's like the only thing the guy would talk about. He was really stuck on it. In the same way that you might have an attorney who is stuck on arguing that his client is the client who is innocent, and they should be let off the hook. And then the other attorney in the case is going to argue no matter what that person should be put to jail. So the prosecution has a stance They have a position. It's their job to put the bad guy in jail. The defense says, hey, it's my job to make sure the guy doesn't go to jail and he's innocent until proven guilty. And then it's up to other people to decide, like the judge or the jury, whether or not that person is guilty or innocent. So in this area of research, we hear this idea of a priori or assumed solutions. So no matter what the problem is, researchers in this area may see that the same answers exist no matter what question is asked. So you may, no matter what happens, I have a friend, an acquaintance, that no matter what you bring up, he steers it back to the Green Party. Okay, the Green Party, you got to elect someone from the Green Party. And so that is what this person personally believes, and it's really hard to tell apart when this person is, and by the way, also a researcher, also a professor, nothing wrong with that, that's great, but you wonder, like, oh, is Green Party part of this course, or is it just this person's favorite thing? So they tend to see the same kinds of solutions for all the different issues that they may face. And so that's why we say a priori. A priori is just a fancy way to say beforehand or prior to. So these solutions exist before we even hear about what the actual problem might be. So no matter what you bring up, they steer it back to their favorite issue. Here's some criticisms of the stance view. Like the other two approaches, we are going to look at the good, the bad, the ugly here. And criticisms of this one also really center around the idea that people are too stuck in their stance. And so that leads to a whole lot of other issues that can complicate the research process and perhaps undermine the credibility of the research perspective that's coming out from that person. The first one is that people in this area often see the same problem regardless of the setting. So the stance is really focused on that problem, even if it's really not evident to other people. And so a lot of researchers in this area don't consider their stance as just one other theory. They see their position as the accurate definition of reality, the reality. And so that's a weakness when everybody else or a lot of other people are acknowledging that, hey, this area is important, and I'm sure your area is important too. People who are coming from this stance perspective about what theories and research is supposed to do really feel like, no, I have arrived at the one issue that we need to focus on, and they get really dug in. They're often grounded in profoundly personal experiences, like we mentioned. People come at this from a very personal standpoint, and that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is they think that everybody else has a bias, but they don't have biases, and they don't see that their personal experiences are the reason they care so much about this issue, or that they have an unmoving position. So they have this "don't confuse me with the facts" attitude toward other evidence, contrary evidence. They have blind spots. Probably the most written about person in history is Abraham Lincoln. There are, from what I hear, 14,000 different books written about Abraham Lincoln. I obviously have not read all of them, so I don't know if that's a true fact, but I've heard that repeated many times. Certainly there's a lot of books written about him, even maybe there's not 14,000, but there are many thousands. And so what's interesting to me about this is here you have one guy who lived one life, and he only wrote so many letters, he only made so many speeches, we only know so much about him that was reported in the media at the time. And yet we have 14,000 different perspectives on what the guy said. Here are some of the books that are out there about him. One book says he was an atheist. And then another book says, no, he was a devout Christian. Another book says that he was straight. Another author says, no, he was gay. Another one says that he was bipolar. And then another book says, no, he was mentally healthy. And then another book says he was anorexic, and so forth. And the list goes on and on. Now, clearly, just from that very brief list, and we didn't go through all 14,000, very brief list, you hear in that there are some contradictions. I mean, clearly, how can this person be all of those things at once? It seemed that that would be pretty impossible, because some of those things seem to go directly against each other. That's interesting at one level. Here's where it gets really fascinating to me. If you dig down past the book itself and you look at the author who wrote it, oftentimes you will find that their life is essentially the exact same kind of life that they're saying that Abraham Lincoln experienced. For example, the person who was an atheist, the person who said that Lincoln was an atheist was also an atheist. The person that said they were devout believer was also a devout believer. The person who said they were bipolar was also bipolar. The author who said that they were anorexic was anorexic, him or herself. You can see the pattern here. Now that's obvious. We tend to project our personal experiences onto what we see, and that's one of the reasons why people get into this area of research in the first place. Obviously, you have passion, you have a certain interest, and so great. The issue then becomes a lot of times people in this area of research don't acknowledge their own biases. They don't say, well, I'm anorexic, and so I tend to wonder if other people are, and then, I might notice certain facts that other people miss, and maybe I sometimes have a bias in the way I read evidence in the first place. So yeah, it's possible that I'm projecting my own personal issues onto this figure, Abraham Lincoln. They don't really talk like that at all. In fact, they're like, no, he is. It's the reality. It's really clear. They get dug in, just like that attorney in the court case who it's his or her job to convince the judge or the jury that that person is innocent, and the defense is trying to convince us that that person's guilty. Another criticism is that this group of researchers that have this view dismiss other real problems. So there might be other real problems that other researchers are looking at. And I've interacted with people who have a really clear stance view, and they actually get a little annoyed that you're not doing what they're doing. They'll literally say, hey, you should study what I'm doing. And I've seen it at conferences. Someone will present on some very interesting research, and then at the end of that presentation, someone will raise their hand and say, yeah, I saw that you did it this way, but why didn't you do it that way instead? And what they're almost always doing is saying, in one way or another, they're saying, you should have done it like I would have done it. And they get very personal in their attachment to their preferred method, to their preferred theory, their way of doing things. And I don't really ever hear people acknowledge that have this clear stance approach to research. They don't really acknowledge that they do that, and so it's a little bit of that blind spot going on there. So those are the criticisms of the stance view. Now you may have noticed two views have some very similar issues. While both of these views have done the world lots of good, and on their worst days, however, this hypothesis and stance view can be very similar. And this is on their worst days. Tons of research comes out of the hypothesis crowd that's great and helpful and wonderful. And it's probably accurate. Tons of research comes out of the stance view that has drawn our attention to important issues that we otherwise might not have noticed. However, sometimes people get a little overzealous, a little overcommitted to a position, and each of these things if we look at this, extend the line out a little bit and see that people at the edge of this area and hypothesis area and stance area start to sound a lot alike. They start to sound almost religious or dogmatic about their point of view. They can both use evidence very selectively to make their view seem like the only right view. In other words, downplay or ignore contrary evidence and then only focus on the evidence that supports their view. They both have been known to shape research outcomes to fit their view. Let me give you one basic example that it's really obvious if you look at political issues, because there's obviously a minimum of two sides on just about every issue. If you look at the gun control arguments, saying, hey, we need more gun control, they cite all sorts of statistics that demonstrate or attempt to demonstrate that less guns or lead to a safer society. At the very same time, you look at the people who are pro-gun, and they say, if you look at the statistics, when people have personal firearms for their own self-defense, crime goes down. And then they haul out a whole bunch of statistics that seem to verify what they're saying. And so if you only listen to one side, and each side is selecting the research they show, You never hear them say, oh, that's a really good point. They never do that. They're hand-picking. Each side is hand-picking the data that they look at. And so when they do that, each side can sound like checkmate. I gotcha. But the reality is always a little more complicated than that when you're dealing with data and research. So both have been known to do this. And I'm using a stance issue there, like obviously politics and gun control. That's obviously a very clear stance issue. However, the hypothesis people can do it as well. They can get their favorite theories. They can really cling onto those and disregard contrary evidence and so forth. And both can sound very convincing. Both of these areas also use a classic scientific vocabulary. People who have stance positions may talk about rigor, may talk about unbiased facts. They may do all these things that the hypothesis people do. They can sound absolutely convincing in the way they frame what they're talking about. They talk about uncontrovertible facts and what we know is. They use the word that we know this, and they don't really qualify their statements very often. So here are some of the things they have in common. Some of you may have noticed this already. I just wanted to highlight them because each of these perspectives at their extreme can start to sound very similar to each other. When they're not at their extreme, in their normal range, hypothesis people mainly just talk about hypothesis supported by evidence and the quality of the research, and stance people generally are issue-based. They talk about the issue much more than they would necessarily talk about their methods. But on their worst days, at the extension of these lines, this continuum, they do start to sound similar. So here we have three views of theories, and hopefully, even though I know the word theory itself sounds pretty dry and boring, we're looking at this meta-theoretical perspective to look at what the different groupings or views of what a theory is, how they tend to line up with one of these three views. There are other views that we won't get into, but these are three common ones. And as we move forward, we'll dive deeper into the specific areas of research that wind up being categorized oftentimes in line with the kinds of courses you take.